a very old neighborhood on our city's east side between Route 6 and Cass and from Walnut to the park. You first see the name Ridgewood associated with this neighborhood around the turn of the previous century. Prior to that, we'll see names like Stevens and Cagwin's subdivision. So let's go to our next slide.
Now, easy for you to say, Mary Beth.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wait, go back one. There you go. 1862 map. I'm going to bring this up again later, but you don't have to show it again later. This is a county map. It's very large. It used to belong to Dr. Sterling, and my mom bought it from him a long time ago at his auction. But you can see the neighborhood here. You can see the cemetery. And what I found interesting about this particular map was that it shows the cemetery on both sides of the road, which meshes with what some other researchers have found is having people buried in Oakwood, but also buried in Ridgewood. So if we can go to the next one. Okay, and this is the 1873 county map of Ridgewood, and we're seeing Robert Stevens on here, the neighborhood. We're also seeing A. Cagwin for Abijah Cagwin. And those are some of the names you're often going to hear in this neighborhood. Let's go to the next slide. And 1910 map. That's the first time I'm finding it called Ridgewood. It might have been called Ridgewood a few years prior to that, but that's the oldest reference I'm finding to it. And that's what most people call it today. They call the area Ridgewood. So let's go to the next one. So here is Robert Stevens. The name Stevens comes from Robert Stevens, one of our earliest residents. Captain Robert Stevens settled on his farm in the northeast part of this city in 1831. He purchased the land in 1830, but did not move his family here till 1831. Stevens was born in 1802 in Mason County, Kentucky. When Stevens first purchased his land here, there were only 9 other families in our area. The Stevens farm was quite large, reportedly taking up the yards for where the EJ&E are and extending into the neighborhood. I know a lot of people are wondering about Oakwood Cemetery, but I'm not gonna get into that too much tonight because that's gonna be its own topic for a future library local history chat, Zoom chat. So back to Mr. Stevens. In 1836, when we became Will County and no longer part of Cook County, Stevens was elected to be the first sheriff of Will County, but he really didn't want to serve. He was also elected county commissioner. By the time he died in 1864, Stevens saw our city grow from 9 families to 7,000 people. So can you just picture that in a little over a 30-year span, our city growing that much. Let's go to the next slide. Some of Stevens' land was once home to Will County's first fairgrounds. Now, you note the location of the fairgrounds has moved quite a few times over the years before its current location, which is now in Peatone. The picture you are looking at now is from the 1873 County Atlas. This may be after it moved from Stevens' land and closer to Fairmont and Lockport. It also moved to 2nd and Wilson prior to going to Peatone. I'm still trying to establish exactly where this particular fairgrounds was. I have a hunch it is the Ridgewood one because of the hills, but I'm still trying to authenticate that. Anyway, Stevens' land, which was where the yards were, where the EJ&E Railroad yards were, was also used for Camp Goodell, which was in the neighborhood. Camp Goodell was a place for the 20th Infantry Regiment to train for the Civil War. At least 1,000 men from 8 nearby counties were part of that infantry regiment. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, this next one I have you looking at is a long limestone wall as you drive up the hill on Walnut going north. We're going to keep on journeying along Walnut, getting a little bit closer to Jackson. Let's go to the next slide. Here we are. And this is also some of Mr. Stevens' land. It's now a park. And what's interesting about this land is it was also the site of a potter's field where some of our earliest poor settlers were buried. There were also people who were buried of more means here and then were later moved over across Cass to Oakwood. And I've also heard some rumors that possibly Native people, Native American early graves are there too. Not sure, but that's one of the things many people mentioned to me. Let's go to the next slide. So in this same exact area was Ridgewood School. It was a beautiful limestone structure that stood from 1894 to 1931. It looked very similar to some of the other original limestone schools in town, like the original Farragut. The school burnt down and sometime in the 1930s, and neighborhood children later began attending A.O. Marshall, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay. Let's see, as I was mentioning, Ridgewood School and Ridgewood Park, which now has that land, around the year 2000, Joliet Park District workers were excavating in this area and found several early headstones. The headstones were from the Pottersfield Cemetery, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. So we are looking at a early home from Ridgewood. Some people called it the pest house. It was probably one of the earliest structures in the Ridgewood neighborhood. It had a limestone foundation for the first floor and a timbered second floor. The pest house also stood on Robert Stevens' land. It did not likely start out as a pest house, but was likely someone's home. In 1882, when our city was battling a smallpox epidemic, the afflicted were sent here to stay and probably die. At that time, some people referred to this area as Quarantine Hill. By the late 1880s, people with contagious diseases were no longer being sent here, and it became home to Ridgewood Baptist Chapel. According to that church's historians, the pest house was in disrepair when they acquired it. Volunteers fixed it up and began having meetings there under the direction of Mr. George L. Vance. They did not stay at this location very long. They moved in the mid-1890s to the corner of Brown and Leach. The church served many more people in the neighborhood, and it was convenient for them to walk to it. So that was one of the reasons they moved. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and this is a look at where Ridgewood Baptist Church is now. And let me go to my notes here. In the 1960s, Ridgewood Baptist moved to its current location on Hillcrest Road. The church added a school and a gymnasium in the 1970s. And I think that's the school there on the right. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I've got the pest house up here again on the right, and I wanted to show it to you in comparison to this home on Thayer Avenue, 408 Thayer, formerly 206 Thayer. For those who are new to these talks, the city of Joliet renumbered most streets and homes in 1938. So if you're trying to research your home, and you're looking at a directory that's older than 1938, then you're going to have the wrong address. What you really need to do is look at the 1938 Joliet City Directory. I call it the Bible of the directories because it lists what homes were originally numbered, and then right next to it is what it currently is. So you can look at that particular directory at Joliet Public Library at the downtown branch on the second floor. You can also get it on Ancestry, but there's nothing quite like having something in your hands and being able to flip through it. So as I was saying about the home on Thayer, I believe that this is likely the oldest standing home in Ridgewood. It could be a twin for the Pest House. If you look at the two in comparison, look at the first floor of the home on Thayer. It's limestone, it's painted over, but it is very, very similar to the Pest House. It has the long, narrow windows, and then on top we have the timbering. You know, the real estate listing has this built in 1905, but I think it is at least 60 or maybe 70 years older based on this construction. I've mentioned this in previous talks, but we'll mention again also for the new listeners that it is common for homes in our area to be reassigned a build date anytime an addition was made on your home or a change was made to your home. For instance, if you know for a fact that your home was built in 1880, but let's say someone put an addition on it in 1930, real estate records and county records might show your home as being built in 1930 instead of correctly in 1880. So it takes a little bit of research, but if you study styles too, that can also point you in the right direction of dating it. The other thing I found interesting about this house is I believe it originally faced Ridgewood and not Thayer. It's on the southwest corner of Ridgewood and Thayer, and I can find property being listed there as 1100 Ridgewood, formerly 200 Ridgewood. And some of the first occupants for that particular parcel, their last names are Barclay and Lindblad. So this is something worth investigating, definitely much older than 1905. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, so we often hear about A.O. Marshall School, but who was Albert O. Marshall? The following photo is of Albert O. Marshall, and I borrowed this from fellow local historian Tim Smith. He's my friend, and he just knows everything about Plainfield. Very, very knowledgeable about many towns, but especially Plainfield. Albert Marshall was born September 9th, 1840 in New Lenox. He was the son of George Marshall and Martha Paddock. His father went to California in 1849, and he died on his way home in 1850. So Albert was only 9 years old at that time. He attended school in an old log schoolhouse before going to Lombard University in Galesburg, Illinois. Marshall left school to become a lawyer and eventually ended up in the Civil War. He joined Company A, 33rd Regiment of the Illinois Volunteers. After his discharge, Marshall studied law at Chicago University, which we know better today as Northwestern University. In 1894, he was elected judge of the county court and served in that position until 1902. There were 2 school buildings named after him. Only one of the school buildings still stands, which brings us to our next slide. And here we are, A.O. Marshall Elementary. I took this one the other day, got lots of snow here. The A.O. Marshall School has been serving many families in Ridgewood for decades. Let's go to our next slide. And this is the 1963-1964 sixth grade from A.O. Marshall. And I got this from the Evans family. They live in Ridgewood. And I believe Rick is in there somewhere. I think he's in the third row up from the bottom. I think that looks like him on the right, second from the right, but I have to ask Ruth. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is also from Rick and Ruth Evans. This is A.O. Marshall, first grade with Miss Lustig. And I'm told she taught there for quite a while. Let's go to our next slide. All right, and we're now moving on to the St. Bernard Parish, the Catholic Church of this neighborhood. These series of photos you're looking at right now are borrowed from my friend, Father Michael Monshaw. He loves Joliet Catholic history and knows quite a bit about the different parishes. Let's see, you can see the original school and parish on the left with the current one on the right. There are clergy members on the bottom and sisters from St. Bernard's. So how did St. Bernard's come about? In 1911, Father McNamee of St. Mary Carmelite Church recognized the need for a parish that was closer for the Catholics of the Ridgewood neighborhood. If you think about going back to the early 1900s, you know, a lot of people still walked, and that would be a really long walk to go to Sunday Mass, to go right over to St. Mary, which is across from our library. Because Father McNamee wanted to help the Catholics who lived in the Ridgewood neighborhood, he started having Mass for them inside the first A.O. Marshall School. And that went on for about 10 years. And in 1921, Father James Cannell became the first resident pastor. So you can see the new church there from 1959, and then the original one on the left. Let's go to the next slide. And this is another photo from another friend of mine. This photo belongs to my fellow Joliet Historic Preservation Commissioner, Stephen Joseph Wright. And this is the class of 1926 from St. Bernard. His great grandma, Mary Frances Maslin, later Mary Frances Weil, is in this photo. Stephen says she is third from the right. So very nice photo. Let's go to the next one. And next we have Anderson Brothers Grocery from Cass Street at 1207 Cass Street, which used to be numbered 2003 Cass. It was right by the corner at Walnut Street. Henry, George, and Charles Anderson are listed as living at this address and having the business there. In 1909, the store offered a, quote, full line of notions. And for those of you who don't know what notions are, you know, notions can be thread, could be fabric. So I often think of sewing notions. So it wasn't just groceries. It was kind of like a full service store, kind of like a small department store almost. Okay, so let's go to, oh wait, stay there for a minute. I got a little bit more on this one. Prior to the building belonging to the Anderson family, it belonged to John J. Hinger or Hinger, H-I-N-G-E-R. If someone knows how to pronounce it, let me know. but John Jacob Hinger had a grocery, flour, and feed store at the same location in the 1890s. And after Hinger, of course, was Anderson's, which we just talked about. And then by the late 1930s, the Melcher family had a tavern here. And then later on, it was owned by Zobels. The building was torn down in more recent times and is an empty lot. I got to go through it before it was torn down. I wish I'd taken some photos. It was really neat to see the inside. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, and here we are at the EA Cary and Sons Grocery at 410 Walnut. Its original address was 204 Walnut. I can trace Edgar Cary's store back to at least 1896. It remained in business for several decades, which is quite impressive. In more recent years, Chuck and Harold's Trading Post, I remember going over here looking for antiques, maybe in the 70s or early 80s. Let's see, let's go to the next slide. And we are at, let's see, 1114 Ridgewood, formerly 212 Ridgewood. This photo belongs to David Wiseman. It was his family's home at one time. Some of the earliest known residents to live here are Midgley and William Pickles. I'm trying to determine if these Pickles had any relation to Benjamin Pickles, who had a mansion on Eastern Avenue. I'm still trying to decipher that. Some other people who lived here, early residents of this home, were Perry Ufford. He was a timekeeper, and Eber Butterfield, who was a teamster. All of them lived in the home in the late 1890s. Some other families to live in the home in the more recent times were the Button and Wiseman families. Let's go to the next slide. And here's a very recent photo of the home. See how it looks today. I took this one over the weekend. It's all fixed up. It's proof positive that you can live a modern life in an old home. What really stands out for me is the turret. It's very Queen Anne in nature and looks like it's very well preserved. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. And we're at 1009 Ridgewood. And one thing I noticed, you drive through Ridgewood, especially as you get closer to the EJ&E, just so many Victorian homes, and really, really in good shape considering how old they are. So here we are at 1009 Ridgewood, which was originally numbered 105 Ridgewood. This is Queen Anne Victorian style home in clapboard. It has a turret. Charles Kercheval lived in this home starting in the early 1890s. He was a highway commissioner. Also living in the home was Mrs. Emily Fraser, a widow. I'm trying to determine if this home belonged to Mrs. Fraser and she rented to Charles Kercheval, or vice versa. It was very common in Victorian times to rent out rooms in your home for extra income, especially if you were a widow, because it'd be hard to maintain the house on your own. Let's go to our next slide. And we are at 321 Thayer Street, which was formerly numbered 109 Thayer Street. As a side note about Ridgewood, many of the street names are tied to early pioneers, and I'm trying to learn more about the Thayer family. I found the Thayer family living on Campbell toward the end of the 19th century, but I cannot find any Thayers living in Ridgewood area. So if somebody knows about their history, please let me know, because the street has a name for a reason. So some other names that you might notice, and I'll come back to this house in a moment, are Krakar, of course, Marcus Krakar. And it's also called Cagwin subdivision after Abijah Cagwin, which I mentioned earlier. And we have Stevens after Robert Stevens. So all the streets have a reason for the naming, just like when you go across Briggs and you go into the more newer portion of Ridgewood, you will see Native American nation names, you know, like Miami, Cayuga. So there's a reason for it being called Thayer, and if someone knows, please let me know. So as we were saying, 321 Thayer, formerly 109 Thayer. This home dates back to at least the early 1890s, and judging by the shape of the long, narrow windows, I think the home is probably another 30, maybe 40 years older. The first resident I can find for the home is Irving Holt. He was a travel agent at the turn of the century. Some other residents in later years included Theodore Sheffer, he was a fireman, Lewis Huffman, who was a cabinet maker, Victor Johnson, who was a painter, George Lincoln, a roller, I'm assuming he worked with the wallpaper mills, Mrs. Ellen Jensen, and the Jurabic family. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, next is 1120 Elgin, originally numbered 220 Elgin. This is another Victorian home in the neighborhood. It still has quite a few of its original exterior architectural elements. In the early 1900s, Albert Mapps lived at the home. He was a molder. Some other residents over the years included Frank and Margaret Hafner, Anna, Charles, and Kate Stone, Alex Drasnick, who was a crane operator, Guy Putty, who was a chef, and Raymond Holmes. I don't have an occupation for him yet. Let's go, before we go there, if anyone has more info on this particular home, I think I went to an auction there maybe in the late 1980s. Let's go to the next one. Okay, and we are at Trinity United Methodist Church, 301 Fairbanks, formerly 201 Fairbanks. This is the Trinity United Methodist Church. This brick building goes back to at least 1914. It has a limestone foundation and beautiful stained glass windows. I've been looking around for more historical information on this particular church and have not had a lot of luck with that particular one. Let's go to the next slide. And we have the East Joliet Fire Protection District, Station 53. This is their building at 409 Leach Avenue. And just how did we have an East Joliet Fire Protection District? Well, in the late 1930s, Joliet city officials would not let our own city fire department firefighters respond to calls outside of city limits. I talked about this at my last talk on the Cherry Hill neighborhood, and when we were talking about the fire at the Barr mansion. The Barr family had a hard time getting City of Joliet to respond. So a fire broke out at the Taylor home on Walnut Street in 1939. Joliet, City of Joliet Fire did not respond, but Lockport did. And Lockport insisted that the Ridgewood area form its own department from there on. So that's how it came to fruition. The East Joliet Fire Department was kept busy the following year with a handful of fires. If you go to the East Joliet Fire Protection District website, they give a very detailed history over their next several decades. They list when they first purchased vehicles and types of vehicles. It's very fascinating. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, Silver Cross Hospital. The next 4 slides are going to focus on one of the most important parts of the Ridgewood area that is unfortunately no longer there, Silver Cross Hospital. Yours truly, along with many other people in town, were born at this hospital. I also protested its move to New Lenox, especially after I got a lot of money from the city of Joliet, but I digress here. I mentioned earlier the need for better health care in our area when I talked about the pest house. Our town was quite large by the last half of the 19th century, which produced a need for Silver Cross Hospital. The original Romanesque style limestone structure was designed by famed architect William LeBaron Jenney, who also happened to design the world's first modern skyscraper, the Chicago Home Insurance Company building. In addition to limestone, the original hospital had fireproof tiles. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's a look at one of the original rooms for the hospital. I'd say it's about as cozy as hospital rooms are today. No, just kidding. But you know, it gives you an appreciation for healthcare. As I was saying, I talked about the fireproof tiles. The doors to the hospital opened to the public on Thanksgiving Day in 1895. The hospital originally had 33 beds. Let's go to the next slide. And then here's a look at an operating room, which I'm sure at that time was very, very modern. The Will County Union of King's Daughters and Sons decided to call this Silver Cross Hospital after their emblem, the Maltese cross. Let's go to the next slide. And here's kind of a look at Silver Cross today. That breaks my heart that it's gone. Beautiful limestone. Okay, let's go to our next slide. And this is a photo of Helmina Nilsson, Titanic survivor. Not a lot of people could say they were survivors of Titanic. In 1912, Helmina Nilsson and her friend Elain were traveling from Sweden to the United States. Helmina was coming to America because she had family right here in Joliet. She and Elain met Alice Johnson, who was also headed somewhat toward this area, when they all boarded the Titanic in Southampton, England in 1912. In April 1912, the legendary liner struck an iceberg. Helmina and many others were traveling by third class, and they were sleeping at the time of impact. They were also probably the last to find out. So the lifeboats were nearly full by the time Helmina and her friends were allowed to get in them. Helmina made it to safety, but her friend Elain did not. Eventually, Helmina got to Joliet. She moved in with her brother, who had a home on Garnsey Avenue, which brings us to our next slide. And that's 518 Krakar. It is said that this home was built by some brothers for Helmina because she survived the Titanic. It's not known if she ever lived in this particular house after it was built, but I think the sentiment for building it is admirable. One of the home's more recent owners said he found paper printouts stapled to framing studs, saying the house was built in August 1917 by members of the Tri-County District Council of Carpenters and Joiners. I do know Helmina had family in this neighborhood, so this is a bit of a mystery, but it sounds like we're going in the right direction with it. Let's go to the next slide. And next is 1813 East Cass, better known today as Knights of Columbus, home of the best fish fry in town. There, I said it. I don't care what you say. I love it. No, just kidding. It really is good. And you can tell by the amount of people who are in line for it. I talked earlier today to Brian Masterson of Knights of Columbus to get a little bit more on the history. And he said that they began using this location in the early 1960s. The small part of their dining room was originally part of a horse barn for an elaborate coach house. And when you look at the structure, you can tell it's Victorian in nature. In addition to the coach house, kitchen was later added on. And you'll notice in the parking lot, there's a flat spot. I don't have it photographed because I didn't think it was that interesting to show, but more interesting to talk about. But in fairly recent times, there was a most elaborate Victorian mansion on the property that faced Cass Street. And it was raised for additional parking. They really needed it. They're busy there. I'm still trying to track down a photo of the original mansion, as is Knights of Columbus. So if anyone has a photo of this original mansion, please let me know or contact Brian or Phil Arda and let them know, because they would love to have a photo of it. I know somebody who was in the mansion probably in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, before it was torn down, and they said there were 12-foot ceilings in the basement of the home. So I can only imagine what it looked like. Anyway, this land also included a separate home for servants. And let's go to the next slide. And looking at this beautiful Victorian yellow home adjacent to the Knights of Columbus. This home once belonged to the Westfall family, one of the oldest names in town. Julius Westfall lived here. The Westfall name is probably most famous for the Westfall Bank on Bluff Street, which regrettably no longer exists. It was torn down in the 1960s. The Knights of Columbus currently own this property as well. Let's go to our next slide. And we have 520 Krakar. This is the ancestral family home of my friend Sue Costigan. This is Sue's photo. Her mom and family were from Ridgewood. Sue's grandfather was Simon Eisberg. He immigrated when he was just 16 years old. He built his home, and 5 generations have known this home. Eisberg worked as a carpenter. The basement walls were limestone, and the home had a metal door for coal delivery. Sue said she spent every Sunday dinner here, and that a lot of her family who grew up there are buried in Oakwood. So let's go to our next slide. 1361 Sterling. Okay, next are 2 businesses from the Linden family on Sterling. And you notice we're hearing a lot of Swedish names in the neighborhood, a large population there. Linden's one of them. And the Linden family had 2 stores at the same corner. This first one, which is the 1-story, which is a grocery store. And let's go to the next one. And 1362 Sterling was also a neighborhood store. This 2-story one is obviously much older, and it was originally called Linden and Johnson store. And I'm told in later years it was a cloverleaf store. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, this is one I was still researching, but I'm told a Rudiger's Gas was at this location. I also remember right by this corner, but I don't have a picture of it, a very early, probably, I want to say not quite a stagecoach inn, but probably an early boarding house. And it was torn down maybe 1986, 1987. I was in high school at the time. I didn't get a picture of it. I'm hoping somebody else has a photo of that. So if you have a little bit more info on this corner, because here we are, we're at Cass and Briggs. And let's go to our next slide. And we've got Al and Bob's Pizza, 1507 East Cass. I've heard people talk about this pizza for years. I unfortunately never got to try it. I know they briefly opened closer to me on Plainfield Road, and I just didn't get around to it. I'm sorry. I wish I would have had a chance to try it. A lot of interesting businesses. That's one thing people keep telling me about. It was Ridgewood, or all the different neighborhood stores and different types of businesses there, and so many for such a small area too. Let's go to our next slide. Mr. D's, and I'm told by my friend Rick that this was, I believe, Rainbow Restaurant, I believe. Let me look at my notes here. I believe he said this was Rainbow Restaurant, and then later Dog and Suds. And after Dog and Suds, Mr. D's, which has been gone for a while. Okay, let me scroll back up to my notes here. Okay, let's go to our next slide. Oh, here we are, Russ and Mary Lawson. And I got this slide, particular photo from my friends the Lawsons. This is Russ Lawson and his wife, Mary Catherine Fenolio Lawson. Russ was born in 1927 in Indiana. His wife, Mary, was also born in 1927 in Vermillion, Indiana. The family eventually made their way to Joliet, to the Ridgewood neighborhood. They had a home on Cayuga, and they also had property on Violetta, which brings us to our next slide. And like I was saying just a moment ago, many businesses associated with this neighborhood, much more so than anywhere else I can think of in our city, aside from downtown. And one business that has flourished for many years and still does in the Ridgewood neighborhood is Lawson's Garage over in Violetta. This family-owned business has been around for decades. Most people in town are familiar with the Lawson family, especially John and Lisa. They are great people, as are their daughters and their many other relatives. They graciously let me these photos for my talk tonight. So let's take a look at their business over the years. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, this one, I'm told it's 1962. Well, it might be 1959. I gotta double check that one. But look at those cars. Great cars. Look at custom crafts, fender work, body work, you know, everything you need at a garage. Let's go to the next one. And then here's another view with some more vintage cars. Got a nice aerial view of Lawson's. And let's go to the next one. Okay, and then this is a very recent photo. This is from June, I believe. I gotta look. Bear with me. Yes, June 2020. Violetta was dedicated as Lawson Lane. And look how proud everybody is, and they should be proud too. It's a great business. Very nice. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, some other friends of mine in the Ridgewood neighborhood, as I mentioned earlier, are the Evans family. These next three slides are going to come from Ruth and Rick Evans. This black and white photo shows a pair of ice skaters at Highland Park. They are Dan Evans and his wife, Minerva McPhee Evans, the parents of Rick. It's a really cute photo. And let's go to our next slide. And here's Dan Evans again, Rick's dad, on a motorcycle. I know nothing about motorcycles, so I can't tell you what kind it is. I'm sure somebody else out there is watching right now and saying it's a whatever, Mary Beth, but I don't know what it is. But it's a cool photo. I love it. Let's go to the next one. And here we are again with Minerva, Rick's mom. And I'm not sure if Rick's in this one or if it's just his siblings. But for a while, they lived on Copperfield by where Gompers is right now. And I got a lot of stories from Rick last night. I talked to him on the phone, and he was telling me about the neighborhood. He said people would pump water. There would be places to pump on different corners. And then some people would go all the way to the park and get fresh drinking water too. So it puts things in perspective, and it makes it interesting to hear these stories. I also heard about I don't know if it was a panther or a puma running through the town in the panther in the late 1960s. And I asked him if it was true, and he said yes. So, and then another thing I asked Rick, and I didn't put a picture on it because I felt kind of silly doing it, but Rick and Ruth had mentioned that Mr. T's brother lives in Ridgewood. I thought that's cool. I know it's not Mr. T himself, but I thought, wow, that's kind of neat. So let's go to the next slide. And here we are, Gompers Junior High School. Prior to Gompers opening, junior high students were crammed inside A.O. Marshall, which at one time served grades 1 through 8. So this junior high was very much needed. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a clipping I got from the library. I think it's from the Spectator. It's 1948, and it's Troop 2 Boy Scouts of Ridgewood. If you give me just a moment, I'm going to pull up their names off my email, so bear with me. Okay, and I'm going to read you the caption that goes with it. Pictured in their scout cabin in Highland Park, the cabin was recently turned over by the park board to the Ridgewood Community Organization and Troop 2. First row are Charles Foster, Richard Chamberlain, Jerry Smith, Bill Anderson, Richard Johnson, and Don Parkhurst. In the second row of the photo is Kenneth Gustafson, John Buell, Jim Barry, Fred Larson, Fred Cantwell, Ronald Majeski, and Don Singletary. In the third row, we have Bill Barry, Jim Coleman, Monty Buell, Dick Hartley, and John White Jr. Assistant Scoutmasters Russell Hartley, Scoutmaster Jim Smith, Junior Assistant Scoutmaster Robert Hartley, and Jim Blood. So if you need me to repeat any of those, or you want me to send you a caption or anything else tonight, I will have my contact info at the end of this program. So let's go on to our next slide. And next is Wiseman Grocery on Cass Street. And this is not far from Walnut. This photo belongs to David Wiseman. I believe that it was taken during the 1920s. You can read about some of the different products they're carrying. You notice the Flint's ice cream there. A couple of signs for Flint's. I see one hanging and then one on the front. I've got Ward's Paradise Fruitcake, really great photo. Let's go to the next slide. So I've been trying to get a hold of David Wiseman because I wanted to talk to him a little bit more about his family's history in the neighborhood. I noticed he had some of these pictures in the Ridgewood Facebook group. This is, I believe, the same building. He said that they put a brick facade over the original and the windows match up, and I don't have it zoomed in here, but you can kind of see some of the clapboard by the windows if you zoom in. So I thought that was kind of neat. Let's go to our next slide. All right, I would be remiss if I did not mention the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad. Easy jobs for everyone. My family worked there. Both sides of my family worked there, and they live near it too, on Abe Street. Anyway, the railroad was a major employer for our whole city, and especially for this neighborhood. People who lived in Ridgewood also worked at the steel mill, they worked at the wallpaper mill, but these were some of the bigger employers. And E.J., I believe, came into being in 1889. And this land here with the yards was owned by Robert Stevens. When I talked earlier tonight about the fairgrounds, I'm thinking possibly here from what I've been reading. If somebody knows otherwise, feel free to correct me, just contact me. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, as I mentioned, my family worked at the J, like a lot of other people in town, and it's something I would like to do as a separate topic down the road. This particular photo came out of my late mom's collection. She collected E.J. items, and what do you notice about that train car? Look carefully. There's windows on it. This is the elusive passenger train. It was very short-lived. I think maybe only a year or two. Very, very short-lived. And pretty neat to have a photo of it. Okay, let's go to our next slide. And milepost. I have a stack of these mileposts, mostly from the 50s and 60s. And the milepost was what you call an in-house organ or a magazine just for a particular business. And I have a big stack of these. They would show when somebody's child got married or somebody graduated school. And they'd also talk about what the different people did at the different locations for the J. So if you're looking to research anyone in particular who worked at the J in the 50s or 60s, you can also contact me, and I'm happy to flip through my pile of mileposts for you. And let's go to the next slide. Which brings me here, Mary Beth Gannon, local historian, and always open to sharing information, receiving information. If you have any questions about what I talked about tonight, please call me, no text, it's a landline, or you can email me. Email is probably best. Some other talks we're doing this month, I'm not this month, this year, we're going to look at Irish history for the Joliet area. We're going to talk about Oakwood Cemetery. We're going to talk about the neighborhoods off of Cass, near Collins. Also going to talk about the neighborhood by the prison.
Abby, can you,
And
I
in
want your
fall,
help for a minute.
we're going to have a supernatural Joliet talk.
How can I get my face off of there?
Also, we're going to be talking about the St. John's neighborhood. And finally, at the end of the year, we'll have Vintage Christmas Joliet. So thank you so much.
There you go. Do you want to mute yourself?
Yeah, I don't want them to see me.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth, for joining us this evening and giving us a great tour of part of Joliet. Once again, Mary Beth will be with us again on March 22nd. So if you'll visit the library website and go to our event calendar, you can register for her program from there. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next month.